game bookmaking. All you need is tickets and chalk. Change the prices, take money and win. Done our dough, chaps. We've done our dough.
I'd see
patronising attitude.
That's unfair. I would see betting shops return to laying bets as opposed to being mini casinos.
Hello and welcome to this special Gambling Commission Survey Edition podcast, where I'm joined by online and on-course bookmaker Geoff Banks.
Evening all.
Good evening, Geoff. And the king of the Freedom of Information request. Yes, the bombshell-delayed survey one that strangely gained little traction in mainstream world. Yes, it's the Regulus Partners, Dan Waugh. Good evening, the pair of you.
Good evening.
First of all, the Gambling Commission released their survey this week, and it didn't really contain any surprises for me. So, Geoff, I want you to lead off on what you've seen this week, the release of these dubious statistics from this rather weirdly done survey. So, go for it, Geoff.
Let me give you the summary first. What we've had this week from the gambling regulator is the biggest single act of sabotage by a regulator on its own industry that I have ever witnessed. The Gambling Commission was fully aware that the statistics that it was releasing were incorrect, false, biased. They had led the people that had been surveyed, they'd led them, they coached them into giving certain types of answers to this survey, certain type of people. But a lot of people obviously rejected filling out the survey at all, so therefore they had quite a low uptake. They knew about all of these problems. They knew that the anti-gambling frat would leap upon these numbers regardless of their caveats, regardless of them turning around and saying that you can only assume that those that were surveyed have these particular issues, and you cannot extrapolate that out to include the whole population. We're only talking about these people surveyed. They absolutely knew that everybody that opposes gambling would leap upon these statistics and extrapolate them out into the entire population and come out with conclusions like the level of problem gambling in the UK is 8 times worse than has been accepted by the gold standard NHS survey over more than a decade, including the Gambling Commission constantly maintaining that the NHS standard was the gold standard of surveys. They knew about all of these things, and yet they continued with the release of this entirely false, baseless, bullshit survey onto the general public. And they got exactly what they wanted, which is another round of attacks on the industry with a new government in play.
Obviously, you two don't have to do this, but I describe this as completely bent. I'm allowed to say so. But Dan, your Freedom of Information request revealed that of 12,500 participants, 77% of gamblers opposed affordability checks, yet that was only released down to yourself from a Freedom of Information request. Surely now, with this survey released pretty much quickly after you released the details of this Freedom of Information request, this clearly is an agenda, isn't it?
Lee, I think the behaviour of the Gambling Commission suggests that that's the case. If we go back to where this started, I think it's worth observing, when they first consulted on this back in late 2020, they said the reason they wanted to do this was to increase trust in official statistics. Now, I think anyone that's seen what's gone on in the last few days, the furore around this, both in terms of people justifiably criticising it and also some people leaping to its defence, I don't think that trust has increased at all. The Gambling Commission said it wants to be the authoritative voice on gambling in this country, but as you point out, it withheld inconvenient research on affordability checks. It has released the most damaging set of results you could possibly imagine about its own market in the knowledge that they are likely to be incorrect. So I think the idea that it's increasing trust, the idea that anybody thinks it's authoritative anymore, certainly amongst its licensees, has pretty much gone up in smoke in the last few months, and particularly last week. As Geoff says, it's unfathomable why a regulator would think it was acceptable to publish statistics on, it's not just problem gambling, but statistics on domestic violence, on suicide attempts, in the knowledge that these statistics are likely to be incorrect. I think there's a danger you can fall into the trap of sort of seeing conspiracies everywhere. But either you've got to believe in gross incompetence here, or you have to believe in an agenda. And I'll say one more thing. I was on a briefing from the Gambling Commission on Thursday. Their lead external advisor said quite clearly these statistics cannot be used to make population estimates of problem gambling or anything else. And one of the Gambling Commission people on the call said that the Gambling Commission wouldn't be using these statistics to change policy. Now, a day or so later, the same researcher, part of the Gambling Commission team, reposted an article which claimed that these statistics showed certain levels of population prevalence of problem gambling, and she made calls for the extension of the Conservative Party reforms by the Labour Party. So the Gambling Commission is saying one thing at one moment and then saying something entirely different at another.
Kind of get that from them, like the parliamentary debate, if you remember, when they were grilled on very difficult questions, they said, oh yes, we must look into this, but never actually did. And then, like you say, to some other parties, they will say something else. Now, the problem I've got with the Gambling Commission as a whole is that Gambling Commission is set up. They're supposedly an ombudsman for the industry. But yet, as we've seen from freedom of information requests, and one recently, Chris Fawcett, I think, posted today, it seems the Gambling Commission are deliberately steering people into, or the media, etc., into a situation where you should be against gambling. And this is wrong, isn't it, for an ombudsman?
Yeah, certainly it is not consistent with the spirit of the Gambling Act, which the Gambling Commission is required to uphold. We've seen the emergence in the last few years of really quite radical public health theories on gambling. And I may have mentioned this before, but in August 2022, researchers at the Office for Health Improvement and Disparities published a paper. Their proposals for tackling gambling included annual tax increases on the industry above the rate of inflation, which is prohibition because you make the market uneconomic. It included a complete ban on all advertising and marketing, including at racecourses. It included a ban on the sale of alcohol in casinos, bingo clubs, and racetracks. And they even proposed plain packaging for all gambling products. They described that as no colours, logos, or images on any gambling products, which would mean that you wouldn't have a deck of cards in a casino anymore, for example. So that is what this sort of radical public health movement is trying to do. And they are trying to make gambling a socially unacceptable pastime. The Gambling Commission has said itself that it wants to pursue a public health approach. It has quarterly meetings with the people that came up with these proposals. And then it sort of produces these statistics in the knowledge they are likely to be untrue. And using a survey design, and Geoff alluded to this, which seems to be designed to elicit a certain outcome. And this comes to the harm question. So we've got a variety of questions about harmful outcomes in here, including domestic violence and suicide attempt. Now, on the suicide attempt one, it is technically possible for somebody to have given 200 responses already about gambling before they're asked, have you had a suicide attempt in the last year? And was it because of gambling? So we're seeing response priming there as well. And it's almost impossible to look at these things going on and go, this is just a technical exercise. There's no agenda here. They seem to be sympathetic to this radical public health agenda that says, ultimately, we need to stop people gambling.
Geoff, does it concern you that one of the lead mouthpieces on the other side of the coin is Heather Wardle, that is on the gambling panel for the World Health Organization?
When you look at the makeup of those involved with the anti-gambling frat, as I call them, you can see a heavy intertwining between all the various characters involved. Today, for example, it popped up on Twitter. Everybody became aware that Matt Gaskell, who heads the Northern NHS Clinic and is a leading anti-gambler, and he has been very highly vocal in opposing the industry and notably looking for funding to fall away from the control of gambling companies. Although they want the gambling companies' money, they don't want the gambling companies to have any control over how that money is spent. So let's get serious about what all these people mean. The gambling companies don't want their money utilized in political lobbying against gambling. Well, that is quite logical. That is what anybody that donates money or gives money to any kind of charity or any well-meaning people or things like that clearly don't want the money to be spent opposing the industry. And if you hand clods of money to, I won't call them a charity, but organizations like Gambling with Lives, clearly a large body of that money is being used to politicize against the industry. That's what happens to the money. And clearly, the gambling companies quite reasonably don't want that to happen. And people like Matt Gaskell have been banging the drum for funding that is not within the control of the gambling companies, even supporting the recent move against GamCare, who are likely to have control of all of this funding. And they were taken in a recent High Court case that they were seeking control of the funding, basically. And he has been advocating gambling organizations like Gambling with Lives to receive more funding and have direct control over the funding that they get. And it turns out that his wife works for Gambling with Lives.
As they say in the real world, follow the money. Matthew Gaskell is, of course, clinical lead and consultant psychologist for NHS Northern Gambling Service with Leeds and York, my area. I'm disgraced, York. It's called NICE, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence. NICE. I just find this all laughable, and it's all linked. So how can you have someone that potentially is advising the government on policy that is also connected with Gambling with Lives? It is astonishing.
Let's be clear that what's being said here is that his wife is using her maiden name when she works with Gambling with Lives. It had never been admitted that she was working with Gambling with Lives, but now Matt Gaskell has revealed that indeed his wife does work with Gambling with Lives. I mean, it's absolutely astonishing. This kind of thing is going on with these people. I want to clarify something, Lee, if I can.
Sure.
Obviously, I have made a number of comments about the behavior of Gambling with Lives. Often in 168 characters on Twitter, people can misconstrue the way that you approach things. As far as Gambling with Lives are concerned, personally, I think these are bad people. And the reason why I believe these are bad people is because when you look at the tragedies that happen, the suicides that have occurred in the past that are associated with gambling or even exclusively down to gambling, as has happened in the past, the last thing you want to do in life is to push any vulnerable people towards the uncontrolled black market. You don't want people going in that direction. So any policy that you advocate must have this number one ideal firmly in mind. So when I advocate that we as an industry look after vulnerable people, you can't stop people gambling, Lee.
No.
If you stop them gambling in the regulated market, they will go to the unregulated market where you can use your American Express and max your cards out in an evening. We need people to remain within the regulated market and fall under the control of responsible companies like my own. Now, this is not a profit-making exercise. It's an ideal that I have in my experience in life of dealing with all sorts of gamblers, including vulnerable gamblers in my long career. What I advocate is for those people to remain within the regulated market. And I think it is deeply irresponsible to advocate the shutting down of gambling, particularly for those that are very vulnerable but will not stop, and then just casually allow them to go to flow to the black market. And this is why I believe the policies of organizations like Gambling with Lives are so deeply flawed. They haven't thought through what happens to people that they're supposed to care about. They're supposed to care about what happens to our sons and our daughters if they turn to gambling and they turn to excess and they get it wrong. And they're supposed to think through what happens if you try to ban them. If you send them to GamStop, for example, and you ban them from gambling for 5 years, they'll find a way around. And the only way around is betting on the black market. And I think such an approach is deeply irresponsible and hypocritical. And that is why I oppose Gambling with Lives. Not out of profit, not because I'm a bad person and these are pariahs and they're nice people trying to do the right thing and tragedy has befallen them. They are advocating measures that will see more tragedies occur. That's my point. And this is why I'm resolutely against this organization. And there are sensible charities out there that do deserve funding, that do work very hard in treatment. And there are problems, and operators should do everything they possibly can to bet responsibly, if that's the best way to put it.
Geoff, for your company, I'm always intrigued with how algorithms work for your online business. If your company can spot winners or spot potential arbors or people that are going to beat your prices and be non-profitable for your business, that's a different subject. But can you confidently, with your algorithms and software you have, spot a gambler with harm, a problem gambler? Is that possible with your software?
It's a great question. And we are clearly not as high tech as a company like Bet365 with their 35 million customers. Us, with our modest 30,000 customers, we are far more hands on. We have a far greater staff to customer ratio than a company like Bet365, which is obviously IT heavy and would have a very, very low ratio of compliance staff to the number of customers that they have. But we have developed systems, Lee, correct? We do monitor people in real time. We have all sorts of methods that we have developed. 20% of my staff work in compliance, looking after my customers. So, although I am robust in opposing the Gambling Commission and these kind of organizations, I'm serious about looking after my own customers. I want to make that absolutely clear. But there is, as Chris Fawcett, who's clearly a very bright guy and deals a lot with machine logic and machine algorithms and all the rest of it, makes a very reasonable point that with modern technology, it's becoming increasingly possible to, as you say, not just spot winners, not just break down somebody's bank account to find out what you should be selling to them, but also to find out if there are indications of problem gambling. So, yes, the answer is not only are we developing systems, but more and more systems are coming online. Now, of course, one of the problems for the independent operators, the way that the Gambling Commission operates these days, they base all of their policies on companies like Entain, like Flutter, like Bet365, and companies like myself and Star Sports and Fitstairs can basically go hang because we simply do not have the kind of IT muscle that these large tech companies, these huge gambling companies have. So we're always going to be left behind. The Gambling Commission has Group 1 form for bringing out schemes and ideas without any consideration as to how much it will cost the independent sector to provide those measures, whether we have the staff, whether we have the technology. And I do worry about the things like that. But we absolutely do our level best by our customers. It was always the ideal of my father, who taught me at a very young age, because I went into bookmaking when I was about bloody 14 years of age. If you overstretch a customer, if you allow him too much credit, for example, when I started off, I started in credit, or to spend too much money with you in a short space of time, you will lose that customer for life. He's gone. He's done. He would never come back to you as a customer. It's simply bad business. It isn't just about responsible gambling ideals. It's actually just bad for business not to look after people. Only win off a customer what they can reasonably afford to lose.
Yeah, sure. Dan, coming back to you, regarding affordability checks and what's being proposed, it's my personal belief that I think this is a vessel that has been sailing for the last 3.5 to 4 years, and I don't think it's there for turning around because we can all see it from the daft logic of statistics and everything else. What's your actual view, your personal view on affordability checks yourself in terms of, is there a basis for it? Is it nonsense?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. By the way, the Gambling Commission is saying that these checks that they're now instituting are not affordability checks, which I think most people are slightly baffled by, given they look an awful lot like what the Gambling Commission is proposing when they call them affordability checks, but we'll trust them in that. I think it's an interesting one. The whole of the sort of gambling debate, as with other activities, is really based around the idea that we should allow adults freedom to pursue their enjoyment, get their kicks where they may, and make decisions for themselves, even if sometimes those decisions are bad ones. But to balance that against the fact that some people do experience harms from excessive gambling, sometimes extreme harms. And that's really the basic of our regulatory logic. So I think you can see the attraction of saying, look, if we could prevent people from experiencing significant financial harm, which could lead to significant other harms, by using these checks to make sure that people had the money that they were gambling, that's a good thing, right? So if you just look at it in isolation, you say, okay, well, we can do some good here. But against that, you've got to trade off a couple of things. First of all, you've got to trade off, will these checks actually do that? And I think the jury is still out on that. Will these checks actually result in people not experiencing the harms that we're concerned about? But the second bit is, what damage do you do to recreational gamblers who resent being asked for documents or who resent being surveilled in this way? What do you do about the impact it has on racing, for example? So it's a balance. And I think the interesting thing for me is I don't necessarily have a strong view that says, yes, it's bad or no, it's not, because I think it is more nuanced than that. But it's the only consumer activity that this is applied to. So we're seeing a case which we see quite often of the exceptionalism of gambling. Nobody's saying the same control should be applied to online shopping. Nobody's saying the same control should be applied to drinking alcohol or eating pizza. And yet the health harms associated with those things are at least as concerning as those associated with gambling. So I don't necessarily have a problem with it in principle, because I think it is nuanced and you can see it from both sides. But what I do have a problem with is the idea that there is something uniquely bad about gambling or uniquely bad about gambling consumers that means that these controls need to be applied to them and to nobody else in society.
Yes, the grift sets in. But Dan, can I add to this? And I want you to answer this, that the big bucks, the big boys, they kind of want this, don't they? Because the data surely is incredibly valuable to their operation, is it not?
I don't know. I mean, I know this view is popular with some people. I know Geoff is an advocate of this. I've personally not seen any evidence of that. I think where you get the sort of operator view on this, I think if you go back to the affordability checks in 2020, the industry was really quite alarmed and pushed back quite strongly. I think where you're seeing them now being a bit more amenable is the fact that, although it denies this, the Gambling Commission has been imposing affordability checks through the back door for a number of years. So this is where it imposes special measures on operators that say, no, you have to ask for documents at this level. And the DCMS admits this because it's justified these new checks on the basis that checks already exist, but they're inconsistent. So I think my reading of the major operator acceptance of these checks is more down to the fact that at the moment they have no idea where to set their levels in a way that will keep them out of trouble with the Gambling Commission. So, okay, they don't really like this, but there's certainty here.
Right.
I mean, I don't know, and I'm not saying that Geoff's wrong and I'm right, but that's my personal reading on this.
This is my personal experience. I've been accosted by Betfair Exchange 3 times, long-term serial winner, hear the trumpets blow. But in all seriousness, I've supplied them with wine investments, share data, savings, stroke, that I do this for a living. And that's held by Swan Data Company in Leeds, who have license to sell my data as freely as possible. That's in the terms and conditions. Myself and the producer have read that. So what would you say to that?
I can give you an answer to that one, Lee. I understand Dan's point completely. Dan is probably the biggest expert I've ever met in the industry, on the industry, who isn't actually a bookmaker.
Yep.
Bookmakers have, over the last few years, exponentially increased their profits. One of the key methodologies that you utilize with regard to the use of affordability checks isn't necessarily always breaking down somebody's bank statements or whatever finances they give you so that these operators gain a better understanding of what their customer is. But asking people like you, Lee, to produce your financial statements, even though you've been around forever and they've got long established history with you as a customer, is by pissing you off. This is the number one attack point. If you're a gambling operator and somebody seeks to withdraw his money from you and you demand all this paperwork from them, most people end up, I think, probably get paid in the end, but only after an awful lot of heartache and upset or threats to the gambling company that you're going to take them to court, which of course ultimately will make all of them concede and hand over their money instantly. But the fact of the matter is they piss you off. They want rid of you. And so by asking you to produce 18 pieces of information, what the name of your first girlfriend was and what car you drove when you were 19 and all this kind of stuff, is simply designed to get rid of you. So I think that's probably as effective a methodology as anything else. So when you talk about affordability, this is one of the key attack points that the operators these days have. Because, of course, the good customers won't be subject to such checks from these companies when they withdraw their money. But turn back to the survey, because I think one of the things is that people won't understand why so many people, so many industry experts, industry lawyers, people that understand gambling, I'm not just talking about operators, but those that are involved with gambling and understand what gambling is, why they're objecting. What is it in this survey that is so nonsensical? And I wanted to give you a couple of key examples here, Lee, if I can. In the survey results from the people that they surveyed, these things are not random, we know that. They state that online betting on sports or races, so that's basically what I do for a living, is a 2.1% problem gambling rate. Okay, there's probably a better way of putting that. Essentially, that's what the results come out with. Okay, so that's a massive leap from the 0.3 that it used to be. Do you know which figure is 50% larger than that? It is betting on sports and races in person.
Wow.
So that means that these people that were surveyed are saying that going to the racetrack and betting with a track bookmaker or going into a betting shop when you've got money in your pocket, because you can't gamble on a racetrack unless you've got cash, your own money, not possible. Or these days, of course, increasingly you can use a debit card, but it is still a very small percentage of how much bookmakers take on UK racetracks. But the figures come out that betting in person is 50% more dangerous, more harmful than betting online. Now, I've run betting shops and I've run, of course, an on-course operation for nearly 40 years now. And I can tell you that I have never in my life seen a more ridiculous statistic, a bigger bastardization of statistics than that. The idea that somebody that bets online has a potential for less harm than somebody who goes, for example, on a UK racetrack is nonsensical. It's absolutely absurd. All previous surveys have very sensibly tagged betting in person as extremely low for problem gambling. But this survey is showing a giant leap in the dangers involved of betting actually in person. And the other thing that comes out from the survey is the ideation of suicides. And when these people that they surveyed were asked, had they considered suicide in the last year as a result of gambling, of course, they made it all about gambling, which I know Dan will cover in a minute. 11% said they had considered committing suicide as a result of gambling. If we extrapolate that out, that would have the 13.4 million online gamblers in this country. That would equate to 1.5 million people considering committing suicide. This is the kind of absurd bullshit. There's no other way to describe it. Bullshit that they've come out with this in the survey. I looked at it and I thought they must have gone into a mental asylum here and got people in there to fill out this form to gain results like that, because I've never seen numbers like that. Last year in the UK, 5,000 odd people unhappily took their lives for a variety of different reasons, as we know. That's to sort of give you some kind of perspective over the claims being made in this survey. Little wonder the Gambling Commission itself and Heather Wardle wrote an email questioning the results, basically saying, lads, we better not release this because it looks entirely suspect, but they went ahead anyway.
Yeah.
If you look into these figures, Lee, they are utterly astonishing.
Yeah, I have. I read Chris Snowden's take on it as well in The Critic, and it was quite damning. Dan, I'm sure you've plenty to say on this.
Yeah, look, I mean, on the suicide figures, I think there's some interesting stuff in here. I don't really understand what the purpose of the question is about the attribution question. The response asked to give a lot of information about gambling. Then they said, have you attempted suicide and was it because of gambling? There's clearly priming going on there. But also, we know suicide is incredibly complex. The Rory O'Connor, who's the sort of expert on this, describes it as the outcome of a perfect storm of negative events. So it's never one thing. So if you're genuinely interested in addressing risk of suicide, we should be far more interested in this question. We do sort of try to ignore it, and that's the wrong approach. But if you're genuinely interested in this, you'd want to understand the sort of full range of things that might be leading to this. Or if gambling is a contributory factor, you'd want to understand how that fits with other contributory factors. But getting a result that says X many gamblers had attempted suicide and Y said it was because of gambling in part or a lot doesn't really give you any meaningful information in which to address risk of suicide. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing that's quite interesting here is that, as Chris Snowden points out in his article, the rate of a suicide ideation or attempt was very similar between gamblers and non-gamblers. And by the way, it was more than double what the NHS thinks is the rate, which again gives you an idea. This is clearly a skewed sample here. This is clearly in the sample people with poorer mental health than we see in the population at large. But the fact that these were so close, and also the fact that we know that people who have gambling problems, as with people with any mental health disorder, are at elevated risk. So nobody's disputing that. So the fact that the figures were very close between gamblers and non-gamblers must suggest that gamblers have a lower rate of suicide attempt and ideation than non-gamblers when you exclude the problem gamblers. And this doesn't get talked about often enough. We see in the health surveys, in fact, that gamblers actually have better mental health and well-being scores than non-gamblers. So there's other bits and pieces of information here in this survey that aren't being disclosed. And we have to ask, well, why wasn't that disclosed? On every other thing, they'll give you the harms by problem gambling score. I strongly suspect what this will show is that recreational gamblers are at lower risk of suicide, quite substantially lower risk of suicide attempt than non-gamblers. That's information that we should consider as well. We shouldn't be always looking at one side of the ledger.
Indeed.
And then one other thing is that I just don't think the Gambling Commission should be trusted with these sorts of topics. People have told me off for sort of going on about this, but in September 2021, Public Health England produced their economic and social costs of gambling. In it, they claim that 409 people died by suicide associated with problem gambling only. Now, in April the following year, the Gambling Commission reviewed that and stated that it was not based on reliable data. The Gambling Commission then decided to bury that verdict. They didn't tell anyone, they didn't tell the Secretary of State, which is their duty to. So you have a situation here where they've buried information about suicide. They have funded Gambling with Lives to disseminate what they consider to be misinformation through education programs. They've even funded a suicide research program, which is due to report back next year, in which Gambling with Lives are on the research consortium. So I think there's a big question here. This is such a sensitive subject. It's such an important subject. The Gambling Commission has shown that it's not prepared to deal with it honestly. And I really question whether they should be going into this area in such a political way. It warrants far more serious attention than that. It should not be a political plaything for them.
Good point, Stan. Geoff, the Gambling Commission now should be investigated, shouldn't they? There should be an investigation into the entire board of the Gambling Commission and what they've been doing for the whole tenure. Because from what Dan said, what you've said yourself, it's disgraceful, isn't it?
Dan is, of course, far more measured than I am, and I am an operator. So, of course, speaking out against the Gambling Commission could be construed as commercial suicide. I believe in fighting for what is right. I believe in fighting personal freedoms of people and their right of people to gamble if they want to. In answer to your question, Lee, yes, they should be investigated. They're simply not fit for purpose. There are far too many examples of the Gambling Commission not behaving in an honest fashion. And this has only occurred since Andrew Rhodes took over this organisation. They have hit a series of incidents, clear dishonesty, hiding information that they know about, funding organisations that with industry money that they absolutely know is being used against that industry, and then denying that they check where the nearly £90 million that they've dispersed of industry funds to various organisations as to how this money is being spent. I want to quote Chris Fawcett here because he's very eloquent, he's very intelligent, and I've
He is.
got a lot of respect for Chris. I never want Chris as a customer, so he knows that. I want to speak that absolutely clear. Chris, fuck off. I don't want your business. But he's very eloquent. And he said today, no one is independent in the debate. Charities, public health, and academics stand to benefit from extra money by suggesting there is a big gambling problem. Operators benefit from suggesting that there is little problem. The Gambling Commission should be neutral and employ neither. Now, I would add to Chris's gang of three, the charities, public health, and academics, the Gambling Commission itself. Its budgets have ballooned, its staffing has ballooned. Andrew Rhodes's salary doubled this year, comically. No
Wow.
matter how many failures he did, they pay him extra money. The pigs are in the trough. And the worse make out the problem to be, the better everybody is financially. And you've got to look at that. And the other thing which Dan hasn't mentioned, the Gambling Commission is all about one thing. And it certainly isn't people like you, Lee. They are about harm. Everything that they do points to harm. Every policy advisor is focused on harm. Heather Wardle, people like that are only focused on harm. They have policy units who create policy for the Gambling Commission, and they only employ people into those policy units who have had personal previous experience of gambling harm. When you have a regulator that regulates and excludes from policy the millions of people who gamble without issue, people that I see and deal with and have dealt with for decades, they are totally ignored because the Gambling Commission has a myopic focus on harm and nothing else. And of course, this agenda that they have benefits themselves financially, makes the problem appear to be a lot worse, makes them more relevant as an organization than ever before. But in answer to your question, I prefer to think that they're deeply incompetent than corrupt. They're just simply deeply incompetent. But it is a reasonable assumption for a regulator like this that some people are taking, because of all the dishonest things that they are doing, that they are institutionally corrupt. If you look at their job board and you look at, say, the commissioners that they're looking to employ, these are commissioners that go around, look at gambling companies, talk to gambling companies, see how they've been behaving and such like. None of the criteria for people that they are looking to employ as commissioners are being asked if they've got any experience whatsoever in the gambling industry. So they're being asked to go into operators, but know nothing about the industry. And that is true of just about of every category of employee that the Gambling Commission is currently trying to employ on their job board, on LinkedIn and things like that. How are we to view such behaviour?
I'm confused as a punter. Michael Duggar of the Bet Gaming Council came out with figures that it's £5,000 a month. The Gambling Commission, very obtuse. They say like the 31st of August, it's going to be £500 a month for all. Dan, have I got this right?
Yeah, well, there's two checks. There's the financial vulnerability check. I'm trying to get these right, and the financial risk assessment. I think the £500 is for a sort of what is meant to be a check that goes on behind the scenes. So it's just standardizing the sort of due diligence checks that currently are taking place anyway. And the higher level, I think, is where credit reference agencies, for example, are being asked for an assessment, or the customers having to provide documents. That's where those two levels are.
Is that why the mark what Duggar's saying at the moment?
I have to confess, I've kind of lost track of this slightly.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a sort of interim solution, but the pilot will take place from the 31st of August. I think what's interesting about the pilot is they still haven't said how they're going to assess it. And I asked the Gambling Commission on a webcast last week, what's your criteria for assessing the effectiveness of the affordability checks? And the answer was sort of, we haven't disclosed them yet.
Actually, the answer was 10 minutes of waffle.
Well,
It was waffle from Tim Miller. I literally was nodding off. I thought, when's he going to answer the question? I think these people think they're politicians, Dan.
Well, I think there are some people that don't like to answer awkward questions. He sort of then indicated that it wasn't really a pilot in the way they normally do it, because it wasn't a pilot of whether to implement the policy or not. And that confused me a bit, because certainly as far as the DCMS's utterance has been concerned, this is a genuine pilot. And if these tests cannot be implemented frictionlessly, they won't go ahead. So there just seems to be a bit of a suggestion that the Commission's saying one thing and the government's saying the other. But certainly the fact that the Gambling Commission's not even disclosed how it's going to evaluate these pilots doesn't fill you with a huge amount of confidence it's going to be done properly.
Any time as a regulator, if you're regulating gambling, if you're really concerned about vulnerable people, you shouldn't be looking at the fucking number. It is not a number. I've given this example before, and I unashamedly will give it again. If somebody is earning £400 a week at McDonald's, they probably only got about £100 worth of free disposable money left by the time they paid all their taxes and everything else like that, paid their rent. And they're spending £150 or £200 a week of their money on gambling, they have got a problem. And this is somebody that's betting at a very low level. So the Gambling Commission is myopically focused on the number. They are targeting people, usually much wealthier people, people who gamble habitually and are used to dealing with those kind of amounts. People with plenty of money in life are all going to be disproportionately discriminated against because they choose to bet at high levels. Levels, of course, much higher than Andrew Rhodes probably bets at. And the fact of the matter is that you can't base sensible regulation on a number. It's a fiction. It's a nonsense. It's absurd. When we look at and when we have meetings, weekly meetings with my staff, are discussing customers all the time, conversations about people betting with us in real time. And we are looking at levels of gamblers at all gambling levels. Because somebody, for example, who starts off depositing tenors with you, Lee, then 20, then 30, and he's still betting at 4 a.m. And by that time, he's depositing 100. These are the kind of flags that are not based on numbers. That person probably has very little money to spend in life and is clearly overstretching himself, and you can see it in his pattern of deposits. That isn't the only indicator. There are lots of other ways that you can identify people using basic methods that we've had in place for an awful long time now, well before any of this nonsensical affordability shit. If you're really committed to looking after people on a number, just doesn't work. And they've been told this.
Do you remember an old podcast we did? And I said to you, and this is honest, and I remortgaged my house to give myself more bankroll to play. You said to me, well, if that flagged up on our systems, we wouldn't allow you to play it. I'm here where I am because this is what I do. I'm on the other side of the fence. I bet for a living. I'm going to become probably obsolete within maybe 12 months. I don't know what's going to happen, but is that fair on me? That's gambling harm, isn't it? I can't feed my kids. I can't do my thing.
They don't care. The Heather Wardles of this world, the Andrew Rhodes of this world, the Tim Millers of this world, they simply do not care about the mental health of people who have gambled all their lives. The mental health of people where gambling is their business, represents their livelihood, who can't produce bank statements, for example, or comprehensive financial accounts to prove that the deposits that they're making. One of the reasons for that is, of course, the Gambling Commission, again, monumental incompetence, do not understand the words betting bank that many people employ. They employ an amount of money that they have set aside for the purposes of gambling. Since people were rolling around rocks and Stanley Kubrick was taking pictures of them, that people have employed betting banks. The Gambling Commission doesn't recognize that whatsoever. They say that if you withdraw from an operator, you're going to take that money, you're going to put some of it into your mortgage, some of it into your car, give some of it to your wife and pay for somebody's school fees and all this sort of nonsense. That is an absolute fiction. What people do is they take their earnings in life and they split it up. But their gambling money, they treat entirely different. But go back to your original point, they don't care about people who have gambled all their lives, that love gambling. That's part of their life. It adds value to them. They don't seem to understand how much damage they're caused. I'd like to sit down with Heather Wardle and explain to her how much damage she causes by failing to properly represent, discuss, and survey, get to understand people who gamble without issue. And what is the effect on people like that when you get shut down because you've got CCJ against you and stuff like that. And then we, as operators, I'm afraid, going to your point, we have to close down people where we have any kind of legitimate doubts. Somebody might have had a CCJ or been declared bankrupt 10 years ago. And we're looking at them now and saying, well, all their finances look in order now. We keep them under very strict watch. But if they're recently bankrupt, for example, we almost have to shut them down. There's no choice. They may have got their lives in order, but they may be completely back on in A1 condition and everything else like that. There are a myriad of reasons now why we have to shut people down. People that legitimately can afford to gamble are being shut down, and nobody cares. Not at the Gambling Commission, not at Gambling with Lives. They don't care about other people. They only care about their own narrow, blinkered view of life.
Yep, it's so sad because I've made a lot of acquaintances, friends through this sport over the years, and it's been my life really for the best part of 30 years. Like yourself, Geoff, it's very sad that it's come to this. But Dan, coming back to you, what do you see the future? Is there a way out of this, or do you think the ship has sailed?
I think it's really concerning, and I think certainly I don't think the industry's woken up to just how serious the situation is. And I'll just give you a few examples. So, what drives policy? Well, research drives, evidence drives policy. The Gambling Commission last week decided to push out hugely damaging statistics about their market in the knowledge that they were likely to be untrue. That's just the start. When this levy kicks in, new safer gambling levy, we'll probably see about £30 million given to researchers. If that is done in the same way that the Gambling Commission's handed out regulatory settlements, that will be £30 million to fund anti-gambling research. We have got Gambling with Lives, Geoff's pals, working with the Department of Education on what children should be taught about gambling in schools. We've got the Gambling with Lives working with the Office for Health Improvement and Disparities about what health warnings should be applied to gambling adverts and gambling products. We've got Gambling with Lives, as you pointed out, working with NICE to decide treatment and which treatment providers should get funding for treatment. So the anti-gambling movement is taking controls of different organs of state, such that they will determine what children get taught about this industry, what general consumers got taught about the health risks of betting, and also they're in control of the construction of the evidence base. And their goal, and they're quite explicit in this, Public Health England said this in their original press release back in 2021, they said, we want to treat gambling the same way we treat tobacco. So that's why they talk about plain packaging, because they're following the same playbook. They want to make gambling socially unacceptable, and then ultimately they want to extinguish it. And that is why these things about what children are taught and health warnings, etc., become so important, because once you make it socially unacceptable, as what's happened with tobacco, then it's much easier to impose really quite draconian restrictions on adult consumers. That is where this is heading at the moment, unless something happens to change that. And that could either be the industry really getting its act together and doing something to address this risk, or it could be punters actually standing up and opposing what is going on here. But I don't see much sign of either of those things happening, apart from small little groups here and there. It's a bit like, Star Wars. We've got the rebels fighting away valiantly, but they're up against Imperial cruisers here. So I'm very concerned about where this is heading. It is existential for the industry in the long term.
But arguably, punters did stand up because there were over 100,000 signatures against affordability checks for racing. There was a 12,700 survey to the Gambling Commission where 77% were opposed to affordability checks. I don't know what more punters can do, Dan.
Yeah, I mean, they're ignored. That's the point. They're patted on the head and sent on their way. So I know we've got the Gamblers Consumer Forum, but we haven't got really something that represents punters. The industry really should be represent its customers, but there are obviously reasons why that doesn't happen. We've seen sort of outbreaks of opposition, outbreaks of revolt here, but there's no real coordinated movement to push back against this in the way that, nothing to oppose the forces of public health.
No. Geoff, you must see the bizarreness in all this in terms of if Lee Keys wants to bet, Jeff Banks can say, no, Lee Keys, you can't bet. We've looked at your credit file and it's not quite met to standards. Do you see the problem?
I can. I mean, I've never allowed any gambling company to look at my finances for very obvious reasons. But I do allow as a sort of dip my toe in the water, one of the Entain group of companies to see just a current bank account that I had. You can understand that that current account had fairly substantial income coming in on a monthly basis to pay for my very modest occasional bets that I have. I don't bet big. When I had a bet, although I don't bet at all these days, of course, because I've been shut down by everybody because I refused to give the data. But Entain, at that time, Entain came out with a line which was just hysterical to basically maintain the line that they wouldn't increase my deposit limit from, I think it was £1,000 a month, £12,000 a year was what they said I could afford to lose, even though I run a major gambling company. And they said that although it was showing plenty of income, well above to show that I could afford to lose £1,000 a month, it didn't prove what they termed ongoing affordability. So that's the only time I've dipped my toe in the water with gambling companies to see how they would react to me. And of course, I've been systematically shut down by every company on a matter of principle. I simply refuse to hand over my sensitive financial data to a gambling company because you know why, Lee? Like everybody else, I have no fucking idea who they're sharing it with. And I know that Entain, for example, share it worldwide with anybody that they do business with, and that umbrella gets wider and wider and wider. And when I asked for my data back from Entain, I said, okay, fine, I'll do my account with you. Thank you. I'll just move on. I'd like all my data back, please. They refused, saying that they had to keep my data for 7 years under their terms.
Mine's 10 years with Swan at Leeds. So
Yeah,
there you go.
yeah. And who are these companies, Lee?
No idea. This could end up in Nigeria, Indonesia, who knows? We'll never know. Right, to finish the show off, gentlemen, give me a predicted outcome for the racing industry, the gambling industry, the pair of you. Geoff, I'll start with you.
I think the racing industry is fucked, but doesn't quite realise it yet. And then the reason why it doesn't quite realise it yet is there are far too many people in racing who think that betting is the recalcitrant child. Although they know that money comes from betting, they don't really understand it. They don't understand how it sort of funds. They go about their lives. I often use the phrase a rather snobbish indifference to the betting product. And there are, of course, some very enlightened people in racing. People like Martin Cruddas, for example, is extremely enlightened. So is Nevin Truesdale,
True.
happily. These were smart people that did very quickly understand the threat to racing as an industry. But you can see it now starting to fracture between Arena and Flutter. And I'm afraid that's a very bad situation for racing. Told Martin I don't agree with him rattling his legal saber with Flutter. You're just going to lose. You have to negotiate with these companies and cut your rates. If Flutter are unhappy, you have to go back to the negotiating table. Racing are in a very bad way, but most people in racing don't get it yet.
Thank you, Geoff, for that. Dan, your outtake on not necessarily racing, but the gambling industry in general going forwards, your predictions?
I'm pretty pessimistic, and I've been bearish for quite a long time. And I think that's been borne out. If we knew 10 years ago where we are now, we'd be astonished at what's happened.
Absolutely.
I'm pretty pessimistic. And I think there's two things here. One is I still don't think the industry does enough to address the harms that can befall some of their customers. If you take suicide as the extreme one, there's a lot more that the industry could be doing on that issue. Not necessarily because of gambling, but actually because you have an opportunity to engage with millions of people and you have an opportunity to take interest in their mental health and well-being and promote good mental health and well-being. So the industry could do a lot more around those sorts of things, but it's not. And at the same time, it's allowing people, whether it's Public Health England or the Gambling Commission, to come up with the most poor quality statistics and claims about the harms from gambling. I don't think the industry is addressing as well as they should the legitimate issues around things like suicide and these sorts of things. But it's also allowing people just to make up any number they like. And that, for me, is a recipe for disaster. I think they have to get much better at looking after the health and well-being of their customers. But they also have to be much better at rebutting poor quality research, at standing up to their regulator as well. That they should aim for a positive, constructive relationship with the Gambling Commission, but that has to accommodate robust challenge where it's needed. Otherwise, you simply become a victim. And that's where we are at the moment. And unless something changes, I'm extremely bearish.
We'd have to just add quickly to Dan's point that one body that we haven't mentioned yet, the Betting and Gaming Council, and up to date, the Betting and Gaming Council has been utterly impotent against the attacks from the anti-gambling mob and its own regulator. They have been thoroughly impotent for the last few years in representing so many of these big gambling companies and their customers. And I mean, I'm hopeful that the new CEO, Grainhurst, that's come into the Betting and Gaming Council will see a breath of fresh air, but they better get busy before they'll be literally have nobody to look after.
I should point out her name's Grania, Geoff.
Grania.
But I also
I apologise.
she could be a really, really strong force for good, I think.
Good. That's nice to hear. I've got my foil hat on, and I'll finish it by saying this vessel, I don't think can be turned around, because the enforcers that be Joe Suarez-Smith as a gambling chair, he's the slots guy. There's lots of people in positions that are completely useless and are completely aiding and abetting. If I was head of the BHA, I would be absolutely denouncing the Gambling Commission and what they're doing to racing. The fact they've done absolutely nothing tells you where we're at with those. And yeah, I don't think it's a vessel that can be turned around, sadly. I'm sorry to end it on that terrible, sad note, but we hope for different. And I hope you've enjoyed this podcast, because Dan Waugh, very knowledgeable, has provided some very good data and knowledge. Geoff, as always, with the experience and knowledge on the subject, and has been very vocal throughout these last few years. So I hope you've enjoyed this, folks, because I certainly did. That's all from us. Bye for now.